Hello, this is the RPG Crawler, and welcome to another Shelf of Many Things, where I take a look at independent and small press tabletop role-playing games and role-playing game accessories. Now, a while back, I covered an offering from Dark Wizard Games, Hanging Coffins of the Vampire Queen, an adventure for OSRIC and similar old-school games that served as the entry point to their Maximum Mayhem Dungeons series. I was given an opportunity then to take a look at some of their other adventures, and have finally had time to sit down and properly evaluate at least a few of them. To that end, I've selected two of their line of adventures to cover here. Now, I should have covered these earlier, but I do note that as of this recording, they are still available, and there's still new Maximum Mayhem adventures coming out every several months, so there's now 7 of them out. At any rate, let's take a look at the 2 adventures that I selected. Maximum Mayhem Dungeons number 3, Villains of the Undercity, written by Mark Taormino, and Maximum Mayhem Dungeons number 4, Vault of the Dwarven King, by Alan Chamberlain and, of course, Mark Taormino. Both of them are available as PDFs through DriveThruRPG and are geared towards use with the OSRIC system, but can easily be adapted to any other similar OSR system. In terms of formatting, they are quite similar. Each has a full color cover done in a style reminiscent of early TSR adventures with a central illustration, number and title block up top, with a quick adventure hook followed by the Maximum Mayhem Dungeon branding and trade dress on the bottom. Each has maps done in a blue scale to somewhat mimic the style of those early adventures, although with a higher contrast than was typical during that era. The interior is mostly 2-column with inline black and white illustrations, again in a manner that mimics the early 1980s TSR offerings, although with a more consistent look, thanks to modern ease of design. Section headers are large and bold, and read-aloud text is set aside in boxes, while the keyed rooms and areas have important DM information and direction beneath them. Important elements therein, such as monsters, magic items, key items, and so forth, are set aside in bold for ease of reference. It makes for a very old-school feel while retaining modern ease of navigation. The general layout of each adventure includes adventure background and general information up front, followed by keyed encounter areas, then any new monsters towards the end. Advertisements for other Dark Wizard Games offerings follow, as well as the necessary legal stuff for the open gaming license, and any handouts that are in these adventures come in last, although this is not the case for every single adventure. So, let's begin with a brief overview of Maximum Mayhem Dungeons number 3, Villains of the Undercity. It is, as I have mentioned before, written by Mark Taormino, and I believe I'm mispronouncing that about 3 different ways so far. And they are the main author for many of these offerings, and they were in fact the author of Hanging Coffins of the Vampire Queen, which I covered before. So some of the things that I'm going to point out here may relate back to my evaluation of that product, which was the first of this series of adventures, and now that they're on 3, 4, and I believe up to 7 later on, it's interesting to see how they've developed over time. Villains of the Undercity is geared towards a lower-level group, being suited for 6 to 8 characters of levels 1 to 3, and the relatively large character roster size is typical of these old-school adventures, so keep that in mind. The adventure hook makes some pretty straightforward assumptions. There have been disappearances in the coastal city of Lost Farport, and the locals presume that folk have been abducted during the night, only to be taken to some Undercity dungeon below, although no entry is known for sure. The group is approached, and it is open as to where this happens, by a lone, fatally wounded individual, who mutters something about a secret door in the Tavern of the Wily Wench before they pass away. It is assumed that he can't be saved and that his body is searched and subsequently looted in order to find a key to be used later. And so the adventure begins, with the characters making their way to the Wily Wench Tavern to investigate. The module itself starts with some basic background information, including a recommended minimum party composition and then some information on the city of Lost Farport, which isn't as fleshed out as some offerings were. It's got the basics in there, though. There is some talk of a shadowy figure called the Sinister One that runs a slave trade in the area, as well as the Tavern of the Wily Wench itself, a tavern set in an old ruined keep. The module then goes into the biography of Sir Wendell Hubblefoot III in some detail, a halfling who picked up the talents of an illusionist, and it plays a fair amount off of the old class restriction tropes typical in these OSR games. His name and initials come up a few times before the end of the adventure. The module includes a rumor table, which has a surprisingly insightful series of rumors considering the Undercity dungeon is supposed to be relatively unknown. I guess the presumption is that the characters pick them up at the tavern itself. A wandering monster table follows, useful for all levels in the dungeon. After some talk about the typical slaver parties that the group may encounter within the dungeon, there's some information about the features common to the dungeon itself, and then a list of random tavern events to be used to flesh out the initial section where the characters are investigating the Tavern of the Wily Wench. The keyed section of the adventure begins with the player background, which introduces the characters directly to the Wily Wench, and just presumes that the encounter with the fatally wounded fellow happened at some point in the recent past, and that the party has already looted his corpse. It is a bit railroady, but it gets the characters into the adventure proper with minimal fuss. Still, it may not fly well with everybody, so may take some adaptation. The introduction consists mostly of mood-setting descriptions of all the various humanoids and monstrous creatures in the tavern, and the introduction of a possibly enslaved bard by the name of Rosabella. There's ample opportunity for the party to get into trouble with the various inhabitants and bugbear bouncers within the tavern as they investigate where the secret door into the dungeons below might be. There is indeed a secret door hidden amongst the various paintings in the tavern proper, which give access to the dungeons below. Now, as always, I'm not going into every room therein, but I will cover a couple of the major ones. The dungeon itself consists of 2 main levels below the tavern. The first has about 20 rooms/encounter areas, although the number may be hidden behind secret doors, which are rather common in this dungeon, while the second level merely has 11 separate encounter rooms/areas. This makes for a relatively modestly sized dungeon suited for brief adventuring by lower-level groups. Now, the actual ability to do so may be somewhat limited, however, because there's not an easy way in and out of the dungeon besides the exit back to the tavern until a little bit later on, and there's a fairly decent chance that the tavern's occupants are going to be rendered hostile by the characters' activities if they aren't careful. Once in the dungeon, the characters are pretty much tasked with discovering and eliminating the root of the slaver threat. There's actually a few factions within the dungeon, such as the main slaver Kreshnar, who has a number of underlings that are at each other's throats, with the 2 main sub-commanders that the characters can set off against each other being the lizard man Lethos and the bugbear Snoot. There's also an elven woman by the name of Sungu who was playing them off each other as well in order to build up her own power base, even above Kreshnar. There is a mysterious fellow by the name of the Sinister One that controls it all. For the most part, the dungeon encounters on the first level are pretty straightforward, being handfuls of low-level creatures, with goblinoids and various undead being pretty common. There are a few standout encounters, including a dead troll that may be there simply to scare the players, or might be secretly alive, depending on the DM. There's a fellow using a bathroom, and yes, this dungeon includes a bathroom, that may be eaten by a black ooze if not alerted to its presence. The centerpiece of the first level seems to be this rock and roll pit fighting arena, where the party can encounter a rock band modeled on Kiss, and be given the opportunity to pass Snoot with a one-on-one fight with his champion rather than facing the whole room at once. Characters may also rescue several slaves from this level, some of which may join their group, and there is an encounter with a dwarf with a giant spider pet that may be of interest as well. There's also a ghost of a long-gone count that used to own the keep that offers a quest to find the ashes of his wife for some help. The second level of the adventure mostly involves moving steadily towards an encounter with the main boss, Kreshnar. Along the way, they can pick up the ashes of the Countess, encounter a chessboard that spawns animated chess pieces that must be fought, and then eventually encounter Kreshnar and his villains of the Undercity. There's the aforementioned Snoot and Lethos, but also Sungu the elf, and Grimly, a human fighter, and they're all mid-level. They must pretty much be faced all at once unless the party was able to take any of them out in prior encounters, Snoot and Lethos being the most likely ones to have been encountered beforehand to do this. After them, there's also an encounter with the Sinister One, who turns out to be none other than the halfling Wendell Hubblefoot III, mentioned in the biography at the beginning of this adventure, and referenced by a few times that you find some objects in the adventure before the encounter. He's actually a fairly decently leveled illusionist/assassin and can make for a very deadly fight for lower-level characters. And that's the first level, the first adventure in a nutshell. The writing and design is simply better than I saw in Maximum Mayhem #1. It's not quite as over the top, although it still clearly has its gonzo moments. It shares a somewhat crude senses of humor and language that you saw in that adventure, although to a much lesser degree. And although there's minor copywriting issues scattered here and there, errors in sentences, incorrect wording, and there's this signature of spell check typos, that is, words that were typoed but then obviously corrected into something completely incorrect by the spell check. You know, it's not really enough to distract from the experience, but it is noticeable. The writing does make some assumptions on character actions, but it is far less stream of thought than the Hanging Coffins of the Vampire Queen, as I mentioned in that review, and as a result, it both reads and it plays better. There's also a few assumptions as to character actions that aren't suitable for a generic heroic group of characters, but go a ways in terms of making the adventure feel more old school when people used to be a bit more mercenary. I thought the included artwork was amusing in places and quite spot on where it appears. As for the design of the adventure itself, I'm rather pleased with the relatively large number of recruitable NPCs, although most of them are of a chaotic bent. If enough of them are picked up, it can make the final few fights seem somewhat more bearable, as even with in-adventure leveling up from the prior encounters and treasure finds, they're still going to be pretty rough facing those last few encounters in there, at least on parties that started at level 1. The treasure is rather generous in this module, not quite Monty Hall per se, but characters are going to get rich and be well equipped by the time they face the actual villains of the Undercity towards the end, at least if they do their looting right. All in all, Villains of the Undercity is a pretty solid and fun low-level adventure with a somewhat generic theme with a little bit of complexity added on, although I'd probably run it mostly for people who are already experienced with old-school play, as one will have to think out of the box in order to escape some of the situations within. Tonally, it seems like it'd be more palatable for a wider variety of players than the prior Maximum Mayhem Dungeon I reviewed, the #1, although this one may still require a bit of care on the part of some groups that may be a little bit more sensitive than others. So, how about Vault of the Dwarven King? Maximum Mayhem Dungeons #4, Vault of the Dwarven King, is co-authored by Alan Chamberlain and Mark Taormino, and is suited for characters of levels 4 to 7, which is more mid-range of levels, especially considering the overall scaling of OSR systems. Again, it is focused for 6 to 8 characters, with at least half of them being some sort of warrior type this time. Immediately, the differences between Vault and Villains are made obvious simply with the maps. Although the overall presentation of the adventure are similar to one another and similar to prior offerings, the map of Brundurum, which is where the Vault of the Dwarven King takes place, has a far more organic feel. Rather than a generic dungeon, Brundurum is a dwarven stronghold, consisting of a few levels, one on top of the other, connected by a circular minecart track that can be traversed during play. There's the main throne room, 2 main levels of the city, with a few side rooms accessible via the minecarts, and then a vault at the bottom, with the throne room and vault levels being the smallest. The plot begins with the characters summoned to the throne room of Brundurum, once a city populated by 3 kings, 1 dwarf, 1 goblin, and 1 gnome. The party is tasked with retrieving the Hammer Fireheart from the Dwarf King's vaults far below, and they are told that the Goblin King and his hordes have betrayed the dwarves and taken the city over. Although it sounds fairly straightforward, things may not be as they seem. As far as the contents, there's maps of the levels, as mentioned, and then one of the minecart system itself, since that plays a fair part in the middle portion of the adventure. There are some full-colored flavor art that give good images of the sorts of goblin encounters one can expect, and then the adventure itself. There's some background information on the layout of the city itself and its representation on the maps, and then a history of Smoky Mountain, where the city of Brundurum lies. Apparently, it was once a place of peace between the Goblin King, the Dwarven King, and the Gnome King, until the Dwarven King uncovered an enchanted fire agate called the Fireheart. He made it into a weapon, and it began to influence him for its evil ends. War broke out, during which the Gnome King was slain, and then a lava titan rose from the depths. The Dwarven King fled, leaving the enchanted hammer behind in his secure vaults, and before he could go down and retrieve it, the goblins cut him off from retrieving it, having suspected it of evil influence. And that sets the stage for the current conflict, where the Dwarf King is hiring mercenaries in a desperate attempt to get the hammer back. There's some information given about King Perks, the hobgoblin that will play a vital role in the adventure, as well as Gnome King Mirren, who was slain prior to the adventure's start. Then the Dwarven Prince Warwick is explained, who might prove a useful ally to the party if they can play their cards right. There's background information on the Fireheart sledgehammer itself, and then on several shops and other important NPCs to be found within the city. All in all, it's actually surprisingly in-depth background, at least for this series of adventures, and takes a sharp turn in that regard from prior offerings in the Maximum Mayhem Dungeons line. This is still a dungeon crawl, make no mistake, but it actually has an interesting story that has a certain degree of complexity that can be worked in with the keyed encounters. And that in and of itself is actually a fair bit of improvement on the series. After the background information is finished, there's information about the general features common to Brundurum City, the lighting, traps, ventilation, doors, and so forth. Similar to the Dwarven cities and certain other MMORPGs, Brundurum is a bit of a conundrum, is built overhanging a vast lava chasm, so there's a certain degree of lighting present throughout the area outside of the structures and caves, and a certain sense of grandeur about the cavern it's in. A random encounter table is given, pretty basic in what it offers, and then there's a table of variable traps, which is basically a random trap table for when traps are triggered. The final thing before the keyed section of the module starts is a basic rumor table detailing rumors that may have been heard on the way to the fortress. The keyed section begins with a massive set of boxed text scrawls to detail the player character's arrival before the throne of King Ammon Brund. During this introduction, they meet Warwick, the drunken prince, and are then ushered past into the king's presence, where they are offered a massive monetary reward for the return of the hammer, as well as a bonus for anybody who brings the head of the king of the goblins to him. They are then given a secret combination of the king's vault and sent forth into level 1 of the city. Again, I'm not going to go over each room and encounter area in turn, although I will touch on some of the highlights. Level 1 is dominated by small groups of goblins for the most part, and this may seem a little on the easy side at first for the group of the recommended levels, although for this module it's more of an endurance run all in all. The ruined city is well detailed, and the individual encounters with various goblins do offer clues that all is not as it is within the city, and that the player character's errand may not have been given to them in good faith. Interesting encounters on the first level include a giant snake that has 8 dwarves within its coils, as well as a kitchen area. The characters can be mistaken for the help by the goblin chef, and if they play along, they are given an opportunity to serve a meal for various goblin warriors and leaders, where they can pick up a lot more information about the state of the goblins and the hammer that they seek, along with clues about a creature called a lava titan, which the party was not informed about. Another interesting bit is a running gag where several treasures have already been purloined, and in their place IOUs from one Hogarth the Mage has been left behind. There's about 14 rooms/encounter areas on the first level, and it's here where they meet one of the 2 blue trolls. These trolls have locked various areas of both levels of this city off and are charging an exorbitant amount of money to let parties in. They can be bypassed or slain if the party is careful, however. The minecart comprises the encounter area number 15, which is itself is several pages, and actually has several sub-areas in it, as well as a sort of mini-game. There are various tracks with switches that go between them, and the random and fixed encounters along the track make for a sort of high-intensity action scene where characters ride minecarts at high speeds along damaged cart tracks, occasionally encountering monsters and obstacles. Aside from the action of the cart ride itself, there's various side caves, which can include interesting encounters themselves. And there is a moonshine brewery, for instance, with an evil wizard and his companion who are in the area looking for a lair and some minions. There's an area with a starving hill giant and a dwarven volcanologist who has been studying the lava titan and has developed some limited-use weapons that can make fighting it much easier in terms of dealing with all of its raw power when the time comes. A massive purple worm and separately a goblin sorcerer are available as well on this level to encounter. And to be honest, they are much more difficult than the ones on level 1 of the city and should be approached with care. Level 2 of the city, after a brief foray into a gnome apothecary, is where most of the general encounters take place in terms of the plot. Here is where the goblin encounters really step up, and they're interspersed with orc mercenaries that work with them. A woman cursed with lycanthropy can be picked up as a sort of ally here, and at one point the party can gamble with dwarf tossing, attempting to toss a bound dwarf as far as they can. If they win, they can proceed without issue, and if they fail, one of their party members gets eaten. This level concludes with a fight with King Perks and his elite goblins, and if they are defeated, the party can encounter Wark, who warns them of the dangers of the hammer and may help them as well. The final vault level is very brief. The party can retrieve the hammer and then face off with the Lava Titan on their way out. However, they may actually be attacked by a massive number of goblin civilians, angered at their king's death. It's an encounter with literally 1,000 goblin civilians, although the area they're encountered in limits the number that can engage the party at once, so can make it bearable. At the very end, the party may choose to return the hammer and possibly Perks' head for a massive financial reward, or they can try to keep the hammer, either for themselves or to destroy it, because it is obviously evil. This triggers a grand battle with the King of the Dwarves and his guards, making for a few distinct endings. The module then concludes with monster stats for the new monsters involved and some magic items, as well as a page of ads and the general legal material. So, first off, Vault of the Dwarven King is definitely the more developed module of these two, and the most mature of the modules I've looked at from Maximum Mayhem game series and these reviews, at least in terms of actual design. The map itself is interesting. It's not just your standard group of square rooms, although it certainly does have those. It gives the city a more distinct feel. The background is more serious and more developed, although there are definitely some over-the-top things within it, the mine carts and the various goblin encounters notwithstanding. This module relies less on silliness and bathroom humor, although there's certainly some humor and silliness within it, and more on grand action scenes and some epic fight scenes, along with some very memorable areas in the city. The factions, although relatively familiar in terms of templating, are cast into a sort of gray area due to the circumstances, and there's some genuine decision points to be made in the module, reminiscent of the fate of Oakenshield and the Hobbit. Aside from the potential grand reward at the very end and the artifact level hammer itself, treasure in this module actually seems to be a little bit more under control than in other Maximum Mayhem offerings that I've looked at. Still generous, but not ridiculous. The minecart section is well done, and between the massive goblin fight sandwiched between potentially up to 3 epic battles, the adventure can really tax the resources of even the most well-equipped party. I'm also a fan of the multiple endings in this one as well. It does have a few minor issues regarding the same spell-checked typos as words misuse that I've seen in other modules for this company, but they're not nearly as rampant in the Vault of the Dwarven King. It's a sign that the editing, at least, is improving as the writing matures. Honestly, I was most impressed with this module out of all the ones I've looked at for this company, although, of course, I haven't looked at all of them. And it bears mentioning that I view this not only as a good Maximum Mayhem Dungeons module, but just as a good module overall. So are they worth it? The Maximum Mayhem Dungeon series goes for about $10 for a module, and while they aren't very long, they do give at least a few to several sessions of gaming each, and at least these two are generic enough to be placed in almost any high fantasy setting. I think that the Villains of the Undercity might be the best suited for an old school experience for a group who is already used to OSR style systems. It's a little bit on the deadly side for complete newbies, but it can readily challenge an experienced group of players while setting them up with the gear and henchmen that they'll need for higher level play. The humor and setting won't be for every group, admittedly, but that's part of the charm of this series overall. As for Vault of the Dwarven King, I honestly think I like it enough to recommend it for any sort of group. A few things might need to be adjusted here and there for some groups, but it's a wild and epic ride that should stick in the minds of most groups, offering some moral choices that set some groups to thinking without forcing everything to grind to a halt because of them, and that's a hard balance to keep. The final series of battles might be some of the more intense that I've actually seen designed for a party of this level range, if the party doesn't handle them optimally. It's interesting to see how this series has evolved over just several adventures. The presentation has been spot on for that old school feel since day one, but the writing and the module design has really improved with each offering that I've looked at. I'd love to see how this continues in the future, and I may have to look at some of the more recent offerings from them. But for now, I'm going to leave it off here. This has been the RPG Crawler with Shelf of Many Things, Maximum Mayhem Dungeons, number 3 and number 4. As always, I'll put links to where you can pick them up below. If you like what you've seen, remember to leave a like, comment if you got any feedback, and subscribe for more RPG content, both tabletop and computer. Well, until next time, take care and goodbye. And if you're still watching this far, I'd like to take a moment to thank those who have supported this channel via Patreon or direct donations throughout the years, without which this channel could not have lasted as long as it has. For those who are feeling particularly generous, you can still support my work through Patreon and now through Subscribestar as well, through the links in the description below.